Hi everyone, Rick Russell here. Stand by for channel markers. At the start of 1945, the U.S. Navy was the most powerful fleet ever built. Fleet Admiral King had not only achieved undisputed naval supremacy for the United States, but had also annihilated the Imperial Navy. Japan's two surviving carriers didn't have planes, and its three battleships, including Yamato, were powerless to resist the advance of such overwhelming force. Yet, some of the toughest fighting and most difficult phase of the war lay ahead. As we know, the seaway to the Japanese home islands went through the Philippines, the bloody sands of Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, which proved to be even bloodier. The closer U.S. naval forces got to Japan, the more desperate the fighting became, and the enemy still had thousands of land-based aircraft. No amount of planning could also have imagined large numbers of enemy pilots deliberately flinging their planes, the horrifying kamikazes, at the fleet in twisted displays of mutual destruction. Embracing the uncertainty of the future and the potential of new technologies, and with a keen eye on maintaining the Navy's global dominance after the war, King and his staff didn't let up in their effort to add more and better fighting ships to the fleet. What the Navy and U.S. industry had accomplished so far was astonishing. Counting only the major hulls, in the previous 24 months, the Navy had commissioned 14 Essex-class carriers, 4 Iowa-class battleships, 2 Alaska-class large cruisers, and 9 Independence-class carriers. The Navy had rushed Antietam, the 15th Essex-class carrier, to completion using new prefabrication techniques. She was commissioned at the end of January. But the pace of overlapping major operations and the losses that would surely follow only reinforced King's desire to add more big ships, especially carriers and cruisers. For example, in mid-February, for the first carrier strike against Tokyo since the Doolittle raid almost 3 years earlier, Admiral Mark Mitcher had 9 of the 15 commissioned Essex-class carriers available. In other words, 60%. Of the other 6, 3, Franklin, Intrepid, and Ticonderoga, all struck by kamikazes, had not returned from repairs on the West Coast. The other 3 were working up, but only one of them was in the Pacific. The fast carriers also included Saratoga and Enterprise, which had formed a new night flying carrier group, and the 8 surviving Independence-class small carriers. 3 of the small carriers were under repair and missed the raid. All 23 U.S. battleships were in the Pacific, from vintage Arkansas to the brand new Missouri. The 10 fast battleships rode with the fast carriers, but for the run at Tokyo, Alabama and Iowa were absent. Both were on the West Coast for repairs and upgrades. Picking up the slack and riding shotgun in Mitcher's task group was newly arrived Alaska. Her sister ship, Guam, had gotten as far west as Pearl Harbor when the carriers hit Tokyo, striking installations and shipping in a 2-day raid starting 16 February. The point is, at any given time, as a matter of necessity, several of the fleet's most capable warships needed to be repaired, overhauled, or upgraded. Storm damage, collisions, and other mishaps sent ships to the rear too. Last but not least, battle damage, especially from kamikazes, was taking an ever greater toll on the fleet, and every major ship's exit from the combat zone required an escort. As ships limped to the rear or were sunk, King's claim that more ships, translating into a faster end of the war, made more sense than ever. For our battleship fans, the good news about the final 2 Iowa-class battleships, Kentucky and Illinois, was work had resumed. The bad news was that the progress was slow. Suppliers and yard workers were heads down and working hard to deliver another 12 Essex-class and 3 Midway-class carriers as soon as humanly possible. In the new year, the Navy's congressional champion Carl Vinson ambushed Navy Secretary Forrestal with a demand to know from him, not from King, with whom he was in regular contact, how much authorized but unallocated tonnage the Navy still had, and why had the Navy failed to build fighting ships Congress had authorized. He also raised the bar by asking Forrestal how much combatant tonnage the Navy could build if Congress passed legislation authorizing even more ships. Because of cancellations, losses, and ships becoming over age, Forrestal said the Navy was sitting on 750,000 tons of unused authorized tonnage. If Congress authorized more, shipyards could produce 1.2 million tons by the end of 1947. Invoking the manpower bogeyman, he told Vincent such increases, though, would require the Navy to induct and train more men. Vincent was unpersuaded and asked the Navy to begin contracting for the unused 750,000 tons. Forrestal hedged in his report about Vincent to President Roosevelt. On the one hand, he cited the British fleets joining the fight against Japan as a reason not to build, while on the other, he suggested building more ships might be relatively inexpensive insurance after all. The prospect of heavy losses was real enough. On 4 January, a kamikaze sank the escort carrier Omani Bay. 2 days later, on 6 January, during the pre-invasion bombardment at Luzon, a kamikaze flew into the bridge of battleship New Mexico, killing her commanding officer and 29 others. 87 of the crew were wounded. Observing the landings were Admiral Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief of the British Pacific Fleet, who narrowly escaped death. His secretary did not, and General Herbert Lumsden, the British representative to MacArthur's headquarters, who was killed. California was struck too, with even higher numbers of dead and wounded. Both battleships held their stations, but ultimately needed to withdraw, first to Ulithi, then to Pearl Harbor for permanent repairs. 3 days later, a kamikaze crashed into battleship Mississippi. She needed to return to Pearl Harbor too. King and Vincent, both of whom had direct access to the president, were a powerful combination, although Vincent had clearly overstepped his authority. None of the behind-the-scenes maneuvering can be proved. Dealing with Roosevelt and his administration required a masterclass in political deception, but Vincent likely acted with King's approval. Forrestal was also coming around to King's view, but perhaps only because the Army was making a panicky play for more men after the Germans' initial success in the ongoing Ardennes offensive. Whatever their motivations, on the day after the deadly kamikaze strikes on New Mexico and California, Forrestal, Vincent, King, and their key subordinates met in Forrestal's office to hammer out a plan. King ran the meeting. For starters, he informed the group that the completion of Kentucky, Illinois, and Hawaii during 1946-47 was a given. King's main goal was to get 18 more carriers and cruisers out of the Navy's available tonnage, including 2 more Midway-class carriers and 6 more Essex-class carriers. King also wanted 36 units of an advanced destroyer design and 12 more escort carriers. Vincent liked the plan. The ships would incorporate the war's hard-earned lessons. As for the manpower needed, King promised to junk or give away older ships to find the extra men. Forrestal signed off on it. Roosevelt was inclined to improve it, he said, but he was immersed in preparing for the upcoming Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin. Instead, he handed it off to the Bureau of the Budget for analysis. There it ran into trouble. The budget director vigorously challenged King's view that the new ships were needed to offset the Navy's future losses. If the Japanese Navy was already so badly outnumbered, he reasoned, then equal losses on both sides would only increase the Navy's relative advantage. The budget director went so far as to accuse King of wanting to achieve a cheap and speedy victory by developing overwhelming superiority in strength. What sort of insurance against loss did the Navy want, he asked. By the end of January, while the budget director was busily digging in his heels against King, Forrestal had obtained a green light from Roosevelt for the augmented building program's 84 ships. Contracting began immediately. Forrestal said if the extra ships weren't needed, they could be canceled. With that, Roosevelt and King went to Yalta, while Forrestal left Washington on an inspection tour of the Pacific. The far-ranging fast carriers had spent January and February either directly protecting the amphibious landings at Luzon and Iwo Jima, or indirectly supporting them by trying to snuff out the kamikazes at their source. They hit Japanese airfields, shore facilities, as well as shipping in Formosa, French Indochina, on the Chinese coast in Hong Kong, on Okinawa, and around Tokyo. By this time, more than 70% of a fleet carrier's air group was made up of fighter planes. Surface bombardment groups were equally active and kept the Japanese off balance and guessing. On 16 February, while the fast carriers were raiding Tokyo, the pre-invasion bombardment for Operation Detachment, the seizure of Iwo Jima, began. The Army Air Forces had requested the capture of Iwo Jima to put its airfields to American use. Japanese aircraft based there had proved to be more than a nuisance to the B-29s flying between their base on Tinian and their targets in Japan. In U.S. hands, fighters flying from Iwo could escort the bombers to Japan, while damaged bombers could make emergency landings on Iwo rather than running a gauntlet of Japanese interceptors while trying to get home. The island's defenses were formidable, and the Marines had requested 10 days of pre-invasion bombardment. They got 3. The Marines landed on 19 February. Forrestal had arrived in time to witness the assault, but it didn't go well. As one Marine later said, quote, "The carnage was so horrifying that the blood and agony of the struggle saturated one's mind, dismally coloring all thought. Iwo was unlike any war I had ever seen," unquote. It was becoming a fight to the finish that was making hardened veterans sick. With losses ashore mounting, on the second day, fast battleships North Carolina and Washington added their 16-inch guns to the fight, helping aircraft from escort carriers, as well as field artillery, to blast enemy pillboxes and artillery on Mount Suribachi at relatively close range. On the 21st, a kamikaze sank the escort carrier Bismarck Sea, while 4 others plowed into Saratoga, sending the old warhorse to the west coast for major repairs. 2 days later, on 23 February, photographers captured the most iconic image of the Pacific War when 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman raised an American flag borrowed from an LST over Suribachi. But the bloody campaign to secure Iwo Jima was far from over. On 4 March, Forrestal returned to Washington. King's augmented building program still needed to be worked into the Navy's appropriations request for fiscal year 1946. In congressional hearings, King stuck to his guns that the ships were needed for the current conflict, but now fewer politicians were inclined to defer to his judgment. Much had changed since January, not least of which was Roosevelt obtaining Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan 3 months after the victory in Europe. On 15 March, the British Pacific Fleet joined the fight too. Finally, comparatively speaking, ships lost and damaged by kamikazes at Iwo Jima weren't as great as they had been in the Philippines. As a result, before Iwo Jima was secured and the assault on Okinawa launched, King's augmented construction plan ran hard aground. By the end of March, Roosevelt ordered Forrestal to cancel it altogether, that is, except for the dozen escort carriers King required for specific operations. With that, the augmented building program died. The existing building program was still massive and provided a significant margin of safety, many Washingtonians argued, even if losses due to kamikazes were to go up. Shortly afterward, Congress also stripped the Navy of a large measure of its autonomy in ship procurement, reversing 3 years of congressional policy. The Navy wasn't expected to undertake any additional warship construction unless Congress specifically approved funding for them beforehand. While Admiral King was fighting a losing battle for the heart of the fleet he envisioned for 1 January 1948, the timing of the arrival of the British carrier force, with 5 fleet carriers and 2 fast battleships, was timely. Mitcher's fast carriers had raided the home islands on 18 and 19 March, destroying some 500 aircraft in the air and on the ground, but 6 carriers were damaged by conventional aircraft and kamikazes, causing significant casualties. Franklin, just back from the west coast after major repairs from a kamikaze hit, was nearly lost when she was struck by 2 bombs and set on fire, causing nearly 1,000 casualties. She was 50 miles off the coast of Japan at the time. Her miraculous survival and trek home ended at the Brooklyn Navy Yard about 6 weeks later. On Iwo Jima, tanks, but mostly individual Marines using flamethrowers, explosives, and small arms, finally subdued more than 20,000 fanatical defenders. They took only 216 prisoners. U.S. casualties, mostly Marine Corps, numbered a shocking 6,000 killed and 17,000 wounded. The island was declared secured on 26 March, and B-29 started using the airfields immediately. What fresh hell would capturing Okinawa bring? The answer to that question was the bloodiest battle in the U.S. Navy's history. Okinawa was large enough to support the enormous task of invading Japan. The campaign to secure it, Operation Iceberg, kicked off on 1 April, Easter Sunday, with the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and didn't end officially until 22 June, although diehards were still being rooted out in July. The Japanese defenders' job was simply to delay the capture of the island for as long as possible, subjecting the ships offshore to kamikaze attack, and somehow slowly advance on their homeland. On 6 April, the first major Japanese counterattack of some 735 kamikazes and conventional aircraft based in Japan converged on Admiral Spruance's vast armada of some 260 major U.S. and British warships, including 40 carriers and 18 battleships. Over 2 days, 6 ships were sunk and 27 damaged, killing or wounding 1,000 sailors. It was the first of 10 such strikes that lasted into June. Unable to penetrate the defensive screens and combat air patrols of the fleet, kamikazes often fell on destroyers manning the radar picket line. USS Laffey was attacked 22 times. 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs smashed into the ship, causing more than 100 casualties. Somehow she survived. By the end, the enemy killed close to 5,000 sailors and wounded nearly another 5,000. Of the more than 1,200 ships directly supporting the operation, kamikazes and conventional aircraft sank 34 and damaged 368. Fighting ashore was as bad as on Iwo Jima, but the casualties were much higher. 40,000 U.S. battle casualties and 26,000 U.S. non-battle casualties. 110,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawans died. On 7 April, to highlight Japan's desperation, the Imperial Navy had expended the pride of its fleet, battleship Yamato, and 8 escorts against the Allied fleet off Okinawa on a one-way mission. Before U.S. battleships could engage, planes from 8 fast carriers intercepted the group, swarmed Yamato, sinking her, light cruiser Yahagi, and 4 destroyers. Following Iwo Jima, the Battle of Okinawa was an eye-opener. It highlighted the immense cost the Allies would pay for any victory over fanatical Japanese resistance, especially in the home islands, and ultimately influenced the decision to use the atomic bomb. And that decision would be Harry Truman's. President Roosevelt, who had held office since 1933, died on 12 April. Also, in May, during the long, bloody slog across Okinawa, the war in Europe ended. Troops and ships were already being shifted to the Pacific Theater. The invasion of Japan had been approved by President Truman on 18 June. After Okinawa, the Army Air Forces and the Navy placed a stranglehold on Japan. B-29s had started firebombing Japanese cities, including Tokyo, in March. They also mined Japanese waters, helping to cut off Japan from external sources of raw materials and food. In July and August, carrier aviators roamed over the home islands, sinking most of the remaining major warships of the Imperial Navy, while surface ship task forces not only bombarded Japan, but conducted sweeps that all but extinguished even limited coastal shipping connections. U.S. submarines had swept Japanese merchant shipping from the seas. They were on the way to sinking more than 1,100 Japanese merchant ships during the war, and were tripping over each other trying to find targets. Such senior officers as Air Force General Curtis LeMay and Admiral Raymond Spruance argued against an invasion, believing the government and its starving people could not possibly continue the war under such unrelenting pressure. But General Marshall disagreed. In the meantime, however, events were moving quickly in a different direction. In the desert of New Mexico, on 16 July, an atomic device was successfully tested. As is well known, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, following major repairs on the west coast for bomb damage received off Okinawa, carried the component parts of the atomic bomb to Tinian and was torpedoed by a submarine afterward. On 6 August, the B-29 Enola Gay inaugurated the nuclear age when she dropped the first atomic bomb in history on the city of Hiroshima. As promised by Stalin, on the night of 8 to 9 August, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. Nagasaki was hit with the second atomic bomb on 9 August. Operations on both sides continued, and in Okinawa on 12 August, for example, a plane torpedoed and nearly sank the old battleship Pennsylvania. Finally, on 15 August, Emperor Hirohito himself went on the radio to announce an end of the war. Carrier aircraft headed toward Japan jettisoned their ordnance and returned to celebrate. A week of formal surrender ceremonies followed in early September, the most famous and significant of which occurred when officials representing the Japanese national government surrendered to the Allies on board battleship Missouri on 2 September. Fleet Admiral Nimitz represented the United States. We'll publish a postscript video covering the impact of the war's abrupt ending on Fleet Admiral King and his Navy, but before giving Admiral Nimitz the final word, we'll briefly mention the names of a few ships that were on hand at Tokyo Bay for the surrender, as well as a few ships that weren't. First, USS Alt DD 698 was named for Commander Bill Alt, Lady Lex's Air Group commander who died a hero's death at Coral Sea. Offshore, New Lexington, CV-16, perpetuated the name of his fabled carrier. USS Frank Knox, DD 742, was named for the wartime Navy Secretary, who proved so helpful to King. Battleship West Virginia was on hand too. She was sunk at Pearl Harbor and nearly given up for scrap. Missing from the fast carriers were the venerable survivors, Saratoga and Enterprise, as well as Bunker Hill and Franklin. Kamikazes had sent all four to the yards for extensive repairs during 1945, and they didn't make it back. Backing them up, just as King envisioned, the Navy commissioned Midway, CV-41, shortly after the surrender, on 10 September, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, CV-42, on Navy Day, 27 October 1945. Shortly after the surrender, Fleet Admiral Nimitz released a statement that was broadcast at home and around the Pacific. Noting the rejoicing over victory, he struck a somber note, wishing, quote, to pay tribute to those who defended our freedom at the cost of their lives, unquote. On Guam, he said, is a military cemetery in a green valley not far from my headquarters. The ordered rows of white crosses stand as reminders of the heavy costs we have paid for victory. On these crosses are the names of American soldiers, sailors, and Marines: Culpeper, Tomeno, Sweeney, Bromberg, Depew, Malloy, Ponziani, names that are a cross-section of democracy. They fought together as brothers in arms. They died together, and now they sleep side by side. To them we have a solemn obligation, the obligation to ensure that their sacrifice will help to make this a better and safer world in which to live. That's all for this channel marker. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment or recommend another subject below. As always, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.